Marshall Dayan, who is our guest speaker, and also to Father Matthew Hawkins. We are going to ask that everybody mute now that we've begun, and we're also going to record this session. So if you have to step away, or you know someone who wasn't able to be here who would really love to listen, that will be posted to, this will be posted to our website. I'd like to give just a brief introduction to Marshall Dayan, and I'm going to ask, Marshall would like this to be more of an interactive discussion. And so if you have questions as he's speaking, if you want to just put those in the chat, and one of the moderators, either myself or Vicky or Ray, will either interrupt him, or if you think that it would be best to wait until the end for your particular question, just make a note of that in the chat as well. And then we'll get to hopefully as many questions as possible at the end. And we do have Father Hawkins here with us tonight, who is going to address any questions that you all might have about Catholic social teaching on capital punishment. And so he'll say a few words as well. So tonight we have Marshall Dayan, who has been actively involved in the anti-death penalty movement since 1981 and representing those charged with or convicted of capital crimes since 1986. He was a staff attorney with the North Carolina Resource Center for 7 years and an assistant appellate defender for the state of North Carolina for 3 years. In August of 2001, he became an assistant professor of law at North Carolina Central University School of Law. In June of 2006, Marshall became state strategies coordinator of the National ACLU's Capital Punishment Project in Durham, North Carolina. And after a year with the ACLU, he joined the Capital Habeas Unit of the Federal Public Defender here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where he serves as an assistant federal public defender. He's also an adjunct professor at Pitt Law School, where he teaches a capital punishment law class. Mr. Dayan has had published several law review articles on the death penalty in various journals, and has also written several pieces on capital litigation for The Champion, a magazine of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. He has served as chair of the board of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, as president of the North Carolina-based People of Faith Against the Death Penalty, and as vice chair of the Commission on Social Action for Reform Judaism, a national policy-making board for the Union of Reform Judaism. He's also served as co-chair of the board of Pennsylvania for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, and continues to serve on its board of directors. He served as president of the Pittsburgh chapter of the ACLU of Pennsylvania and is active in the Jewish community, having served as president of the Pittsburgh Area Jewish Committee. He also serves on the executive board of Adat Shalom Synagogue in Cheswick, PA. So we are so grateful to have Marshall join us tonight, and I am going to turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kayla. Well, that's all the time we have. I'm really glad to be with you tonight. I wish we could all be in person, and I'm looking forward to the day when we can all be in person together. It would be an even more enriching experience to just get a chance to see everybody. I was with some friends a couple of weekends ago, and I was so glad to see them, and told them not get too excited. I would be glad to see anyone beyond my dog and my wife, who I'm always glad to see every day. Let me start by telling you that I want to tell some stories, and if you want to interrupt and have questions, please do. I'm glad to answer them as they come into your head. Or if you want to hold on to your questions until the end, that's also fine. So how in the world did I get into this line of work that I've been doing for nearly 40 years now? I was a junior at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia, in the spring of 1980 or 81. I don't actually remember. When the state of Georgia announced that it was going to carry out its first execution in 20 years. So there hadn't been an execution since 1960 in Georgia. So it must have been spring of 1980. And I was, as I say, I was a junior there at the university. And I heard this on the campus radio station. And when I heard it, I thought to myself, in a democratic society, if my state is going to execute someone, that means I'm going to execute someone, because we're all, we are in fact the government in a democratic republic. And so I thought, well, I better figure out how I'm going to react to this, how I'm going to think about this if my state's going to kill somebody. So I heard that there was going to be a vigil in Atlanta the next night, and I decided I would go to the vigil and listen to speakers talk about this scheduled execution. So the next night I drove from Athens to Atlanta, and I found myself in the Central Presbyterian Church, a really lovely church directly across the street from the Georgia State Capitol. And I listened to lawyers and clergy talk about the death penalty and this person that was going to be executed. And I thought about my own faith tradition and how, I was taught that instead of completing the creation of the universe in 6 days, the Almighty created human beings to be partners of the Almighty in completing the creation of the universe, and that it's all of our jobs to work with the Almighty to bring about the kind of world that we want to live in, and that's what the completion of creation is about. And then I thought, well, it says in Genesis, Bereshit, we are all created human beings. We are all created B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And so we all have a spark of the divine within us. And I thought, well, no matter what someone has done, that can't possibly be all that there is to them. I'm sure everyone has done things that they're not proud of. And obviously homicide is something worse than something that you're just not proud of. It's an awful, awful, awful thing. But still, I thought that can't be the sum of someone's entire life, that they committed a homicide. And anyway, as I was thinking about all this stuff and listening to clergy and listening to lawyers, and I found myself nauseous and weeping at the idea that the state of Georgia was going to involuntarily put blood on my hands. And I couldn't make the nausea go away until a little light bulb went off over my head. And the light bulb was, I need to go to law school and become an attorney and train myself to represent people who are charged with or convicted of capital crimes, because I got to do everything I can do personally to keep the blood off my hands. And so that's what I did. And the truth of the matter is, it's incredibly difficult work. And as I'll share with you as we go on, I've lost some clients, and that's a really awful experience. But when I think about not doing this work, the nausea comes back, and so I have to keep doing this stuff that I really don't like doing. I mean, I wish we were all put out. I wish Kayla and I were out of work, and we had to go find other employment. But sadly, we're still employed. But that's how I got into this line of work, and I decided that night that I would go to law school, and so that's what I did. And I just knew, right at the beginning of my legal education, that I wanted to become a criminal defense lawyer who represented people who were facing the death penalty. And I've been doing that, as Kayla told you in her introduction, since 1986. And I've had clients in Virginia and North Carolina and Texas and Missouri and Delaware and Ohio and Pennsylvania. And what I find is that the people who have been charged with or convicted of capital crimes all fall into one or more of the following categories. They're either seriously mentally ill or were victimized by the most horrific kinds of abuse, physical, sexual, psychological, or the victims of the worst kind of neglect, or on drugs at the time of the offense, or withdrawing from drug addiction at the time of the offense, or have intellectual disabilities. But I have never had a client that didn't fall into at least one of those categories. And the reason that I share that with you right up front is because it should come as no surprise that people who commit the most awful kinds of crimes, really awful, horrible homicides, are people who themselves are very broken. Because people who are not very broken don't do this. They don't commit those kinds of homicides. So when you think about capital punishment as a punitive measure, please understand that the people who we're imposing these sentences on are people who are incredibly broken already. So, you know, the second part of this is that we like to tell ourselves that the death penalty is reserved for the worst of the worst. But in fact, it really isn't. It's an extremely arbitrary system. There are roughly anywhere between, in down years, 13,000, 14,000 homicides in America every year, and in more violent times, we've had as many as 18,000, 19,000 homicides in America. And since the death penalty was reinstated in 1974, we've never, as a country, we've never sentenced more than about 300 people a year to death. And I hope that you will believe me when I tell you that it is impossible, absolutely impossible, to distinguish the 300 people who get sentenced to death, even in the worst times. That is, when I say worst, what I mean is in those periods of American history when we are most punitive, which was, in our times in the late 1990s, when we are at our most punitive, because right now we sentence about somewhere between 30 and 60 people to death a year as a country. But as I said, in the late 1990s, we were sentencing to death about 300 people a year. And even then, it was impossible to distinguish the 17 or 18,000 people who committed homicides that did not get sentenced to death from the 300 people who committed homicides and who did get sentenced to death. There is simply no case that one can point to, and I really believe this, there is no case that one can point to and say see, in this case, there was a death sentence. In every case like it, there were death sentences imposed, and I can show you cases that are similar, whether they're mass murders, whether they're the most horrific kinds of murderers with child victims or elderly victims, or felony murders, where someone committed another crime in addition to the homicide, like rape or robbery or arson. Whatever kind of crime you can point to and say, this is a crime that should get the death penalty. I can show you dozens of great cases just like that, where the suspect, the defendant, did not get sentenced to death. And yes.
May I ask a question? Given the fact that you're saying it's random in terms of the content of the actual crime itself, is there any correlation in terms of geography?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking it, Vicki. For a long time, there wasn't, but there is now. There are only about 17 counties in the United States of America that produce about 80% of the death sentences. For a long time, Philadelphia County was one of those hot counties. It hasn't been for the last 5 years or so. Indeed, so another aspect of the death penalty, this is to answer your question, by the way, even though it's going to sound like I'm going off on a tangent, I'm really not. For a long time, we knew, and we still know now, that the death penalty is imposed in a racially discriminatory manner, but not in the way that you might think. Prosecutors' offices understood, because they're elected officials, they understood that it wouldn't play well to the electorate if the death penalty was being imposed on people of color really, really disproportionately. And so in most of the country, the death penalty has not been imposed over the last, I would say, over the last 40 years or so, the death penalty, or 50 years, the death penalty has not been imposed in a racially discriminatory way with regard to the race of the defendant. There were 2 jurisdictions in America where that wasn't true, where it continued to be imposed on a racial. Yes? I'm sorry. It continued to be imposed in a racially discriminatory manner, and those 2 jurisdictions were Houston, Texas, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where the statisticians and the sociologists were able to do studies that showed that really everywhere else in America, it was not being imposed in a racially discriminatory manner in terms of the race of the defendant. Philadelphia and Houston, it continued to be imposed in a racially discriminatory manner based on the race of the defendant. The way it has continued to be discriminatory, however, is based on the race of the victim of the homicide. When white people are killed, it's anywhere from 3.5 times to 5 times more likely that the criminal defendant will be sentenced to death than if a person of color is killed, which tells us that jurors, even though they don't think they are, jurors continue to value white life a lot more than they value the lives of people of color. And the evidence of that is overwhelming, and it's everywhere in the country. It's not just in the South, it's everywhere in the country. Pennsylvania, Ohio, everywhere that it's ever been studied, it's been shown that if you kill someone who is white, you're far, far, far more likely to get sentenced to death than if you kill someone who is a person of color. So the reason I went there, Vicki, is that Philadelphia and Houston are two of the jurisdictions where there are just a lot of death sentences. Duval County, Florida, Jacksonville, Florida is another one where there are just a lot of death sentences come out of that county. And as I say, there are about 17 counties in the country, Los Angeles County, Orange County in California. There are just 17 counties in the country or so where 85% of all the death sentences in America come from. And those crimes are not different, really, than the homicides that occur in other counties around the country. It's just that those jurisdictions, the prosecutors have become very committed to imposing the death penalty, and that's what happens in those counties. Does that answer your question, Vicki?
Yeah, that's a great answer, but it gives me another question, which is, it sounds like what people need to do is pay more attention to who they're electing judges.
Well, prosecutors make those decisions, and you can really see that difference in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was a very, very active death penalty jurisdiction for a very long time. And this is going back now, 50 years to when Ed Rendell was a district attorney in Philadelphia, and Arlen Specter was a district attorney in Philadelphia, and Lynn Abraham was a district attorney in Philadelphia. And then 5 years ago, Larry Krasner got elected district attorney in Philadelphia, and there has not been another death sentence imposed in Philadelphia in 5 years. And he explicitly ran on a platform that said the death penalty is racist, it's classist, and I'm running to tell you, I'm running as a criminal justice reform candidate, and I'm not going to prosecute people capitally. And not only did he get elected 4 years ago, he just won the nomination, the Democratic nomination again earlier this spring, and then there's a general election next week, and he's expected to win overwhelmingly again. So it makes a huge difference, and that's a very good point. Thank you for making that point, Vicki. It's really important for us to think about, but I'll come back to that too, because I want to talk about that later in the talk too, about how about our role. What is our responsibility as citizens? So I shared with you, this story about how I got into this work, and my very first client was a case I took pro bono. I had graduated from law school in Washington, D.C., and went to work for a small little firm. And part of the deal with the firm that hired me was that in addition to taking me, they had to agree to take on a capital case or two pro bono. And they were glad to do that. And so I undertook the representation of a man in Virginia. At the time, Virginia did not appoint lawyers for people on death row after their very first appeal, because the United States Supreme Court doesn't require it. The Sixth Amendment to the Constitution requires that you have the right to counsel. So the Sixth Amendment says accused have the right to counsel for their defense. And in 1963, the United States Supreme Court interpreted that to mean that if you were indigent and could not afford to hire a lawyer and were charged with a felony, you had a right to court-appointed counsel in the case of Gideon versus Wainwright. And so since 1963, there's every state has had to provide counsel for indigent people. And I can tell you that there are maybe 3 or 4 capital cases a decade that are not prosecuted, that where indigent, it's not the people being prosecuted are not indigent. It's really rare. I'll give you an example. O.J. Simpson was not prosecuted capitally, though that could have been a capital trial. But we just don't do that in the United States. We just rarely prosecute people of means who have been accused of committing homicide. The death penalty is generally reserved for people who are indigent. I can think of one case in Pennsylvania, and there are roughly 160 people on Pennsylvania's death row. I can think of one case in Pennsylvania where the client afforded their own lawyers all the way through the process, or most of the way through the process anyway. And the client really couldn't afford to pay for counsel, actually. Even that client was indigent, but his family could afford to pay for counsel, and his family did so. But anyway, so the United States Supreme Court said in 1963 that you have the right to counsel at trial if you're charged with a crime that could land you in prison. If it's a minor offense where there's no chance of getting any prison time, you don't have to have a lawyer appointed for you. But if you could be incarcerated, then you have to have a lawyer appointed for you if you want one. And then after that, the court also said, the same year actually, in 1963, that states don't have to provide the right to appeal, but if they do provide a right to appeal, and since people of means could afford appellate lawyers, then the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment requires that indigent people get appointed appellate lawyers also. So the United States Constitution has been interpreted to require that you get the right to a lawyer at your trial and at your first appeal. After that, there's no other constitutional right to counsel, though there are lots of other appeals, lots of other opportunities to challenge your conviction or your sentence. Virginia didn't provide any lawyers after that first appeal. And so I was asked to take on a Virginia capital case after that first appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court was over. And so I agreed to undertake that representation of that man. His name was David Pruitt, and he was convicted of killing his boss's wife, and he was close friends with his boss. He had what I learned was that he had a serious mental illness that led him to believe that his boss's wife was cheating on her husband, and he was friends with the husband, and he thought that was wrong. And he went to her house when he knew that his friend was not going to be there, and he broke into the house and was convicted of raping her and killing her. And he was ultimately picked up by the police and taken into interrogation. And the police said to him, "Tell us about the murder." And he said, "Which one?" Which is not a good answer. If I had been advising him, I would have said, that's not the right way to answer the question. It turns out that he had committed a murder in 1975 that had been unsolved, and then committed this other murder in 1985, and he was sentenced to death. What I learned when I investigated his case more is that he came from a family that was where his grandfather and father and uncle had all served in the military, and he thought it was his obligation to serve in the military as well. And he enlisted in the military and was sent to Korea in 1965, and he hated it. He found that while serving in Korea, he felt like he was being discriminated against there and made fun of there because he was an American and not a native Korean, and really hated him. And so he asked the Navy to please transfer him elsewhere. And the Navy said, son, we're glad to do that. There's this other place where we need service people. And they sent him to Vietnam. And he was serving in Da Nang in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive. And the ship he was on took a lot of shelling, and he freaked out. And he had developed post-traumatic stress disorder. I interviewed his wife, and she told me how when he came back from Vietnam, she didn't recognize this man who she had married just before he left to go to Korea, and with whom she'd had a child. Their son was born while he was overseas, and she said that when he got back, she just didn't recognize him. I don't mean physically, although even that was difficult. She said that he didn't groom himself when he got back, that he didn't talk to people, that he didn't interact with people, that he just sort of stayed to himself and was very quiet, never talked about his experiences, but she could tell that something was very badly wrong, and she encouraged him to get treatment, but he wouldn't. And he ended up committing these 2 homicides, and so I undertook his representation and found all this stuff out about him that had never been discovered by his trial lawyer, which leads me to share with you a little about what Kayla does with us in our office. Kayla's an investigator. And what we do when we take cases is that we reinvestigate not only everything about the offense to see, did the state get it right? Did they really find the right person? Because oftentimes they don't. And there have been about 180 exonerations of people who were convicted of capital crimes and sentenced to death beyond a reasonable doubt by juries. There have been about 180 people since 1974 who've been fully exonerated of the crimes for which they were convicted and sentenced to death. So if you know that there have been 180 people exonerated, you have to know that there have been some wrongful convictions, and we do know that there have been some wrongful convictions. So, at least 2 of them in the state of Texas that we know about, probably more. There's, I can think of one in Louisiana, and there have been a number of wrongful executions, the executions of innocent people. And it's not surprising because it's a human endeavor and we make mistakes, human beings, we make mistakes. But anyway, so the reason I wanted to tell you about David was, and about how I, went about investigating this case, is because what we do is when we get these cases, we not only reinvestigate the offense, but we have to really investigate the entirety of our client's life story. Because what the United States Supreme Court has said is that when you're dealing with capital punishment, when you're dealing with the death penalty, it's not simply about how bad was the crime, what was the offense, but it's important to know about the offender. Is someone more or less culpable if they have mental illness? Is someone more or less culpable if they have lived through trauma and are scarred, psychologically scarred by trauma? Are they more or less culpable, morally culpable for their actions if they have had every advantage in life or have had none of the advantages that many of us have had in our lives. And it's our job, and what Kayla is so good at doing is investigating the life and background of all of our clients so that we can know what their story is. And trial lawyers are supposed to do this in the first instance, right? Because the trial lawyer's job is to be able to share those aspects about someone's life, about someone's background, about someone's character that mitigate the most horrible punishment, the most severe punishment known to our law, and to give the jurors a reason why this person that they're judging should be sentenced to life, not to death. And what we do, what Kayla and I do in our office, is that we reinvestigate these cases where people have been sentenced to death to make sure that the job was done right in the first instance. And I can tell you that most of the time it was not. And we can talk about why, but it's an easy answer. Pennsylvania is the only state in the country where the state provides no money for indigent defense services. In Pennsylvania, indigent defense services are provided at the county level only. So the taxpayers of Allegheny County have to pick up the tab for providing counsel to indigents in criminal cases. The citizens of Philadelphia do the same. The citizens of Westmoreland County do the same. But the state provides no additional funding for indigent defense services. And as I say, we're the only state in the country where that's true. And so what that means is that when county commissioners, when the county legislators are having to decide, where are we going to put our money? Are we going to put it in roads? Are we going to put it in schools? Are we going to put it in family services? Are we going to put it in programs for the needy, whether it's housing programs or medical care or food? Or are we going to provide adequate counsel to people who are charged with crimes? Guess what gets on the short end of the stick all the time, right? When the elected officials have to make those decisions about where are we going to spend our money, they almost never say, gee, let's give some lawyers more money. And so, there's an old saying, you get what you pay for. And we in Pennsylvania do. We get what we pay for. So there have been over 275, nearly 300 cases where people who were sentenced to death, either their death sentence or their conviction was overturned on appeal at one level of appeal or another based on ineffective assistance of trial counsel. That is to say, the work that the trial lawyers did fell below an objective standard of reasonableness. The performance that fell below an objective standard of reasonableness was prejudicially bad. So we're doing stuff on the cheap here, and we're trying these cases and paying the lawyers next to nothing. And then those cases are getting overturned, and they're either getting retried or they're getting negotiated out by way of plea. But we're spending a lot more money doing it over and over and over again than we would be spending if we actually put the resources into doing the criminal justice system the right way at the beginning. But we've made the decision, and when I say we, I mean all of us, because we live in a democratic republic. We've made the decision to do it this way. Are there any questions at the moment?
Joyce has one, or Michael.
Yes, I would like to ask Marshall about the case of Mumia Abu Jamal. He is upheld by many people as quite an extraordinary person of integrity and so on. And but he's still on death row. And have you any reflections on his case?
I don't know the case really well. First of all, let me clarify that he is not still on death row. He's serving life in prison, but his death sentence was overturned. And so he is serving life, not death. I know that he claims that he's innocent, and he may well be. Innocent. I don't know. I just don't know the case that well. He is a remarkable writer, and he says he didn't commit this homicide. Obviously, it's a very, very high profile case. I was advised that the current district attorney in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, may well have represented him earlier in the process when he was before he was the district attorney, when he was a civil rights and criminal defense lawyer. So I really don't know a lot about the case, but I can tell you he's no longer on death row. You're muted.
Hold on, go ahead.
Follow up. It's often alleged, and I think it is alleged in the case of Mumia Abu Jamal, that very often the police, in their identifying the culprit for a crime, that they are prejudiced. The Innocence Project has shown this, that in many cases that they picked the wrong person and accused them of the crime, and then created the evidence more or less to suit the crime. So that a lot of it goes back to police, if you like, not so much misconduct, but biased behavior, etc.
Well, let me speak to that. I am very reluctant to ever accuse anyone of intentional misconduct. It happens. It absolutely does, and I don't deny that it happens. But I'm cautious about ever accusing people of that unless I'm darn sure about it, because I think that's an awful thing to accuse someone of. What I will say is this: in homicide cases, all of them are high profile. If someone is killed, that by nature is a high profile case, and some are even some homicides are even more high profile than others. When that happens, there's a great deal of pressure on law enforcement to solve that crime. And they feel that pressure. I know they do. And I don't blame them. I understand why they feel it. And so the way our system works, our system moves very quickly from being an investigatory system to an adversarial system. So that, in other countries, they have criminal justice systems where just because someone has been identified as a suspect doesn't mean that you start throwing away evidence that doesn't point to that suspect. In our system, however, what often happens is we have this investigatory system until a suspect has been identified. And then once a suspect has been identified, all of the effort goes into proving that that suspect is in fact guilty of the offense, rather than continuing to sort of be open-minded about what the evidence shows. Once a suspect has been identified, all of the effort, all of the energy goes toward establishing evidence that shows that that person committed the offense, even when oftentimes there's some other evidence that shows up that doesn't fit that scenario. Do you follow what I'm saying? And then another issue that you raised is about identification. And one of the things that we know, one of the things that science tells us, is that eyewitness identification is particularly unreliable. We get it wrong. Our brains work in a way that we think we've seen something, and we get that wrong a lot. We get that wrong a lot. And I will direct people to a book, not about a capital case, but about a rape case called Picking Cotton. And Picking Cotton is the story of a woman who was raped in Elon, North Carolina as a college student. And during the course of this awful attack on her, she did everything she could do to make sure that she saw her assailant. I mean, she really thought it through. Like when her assailant came into her apartment, and while he was there, she would come up with things like to turn lights on. She would say, "Oh, I'm really thirsty. May I get something to drink? Can I get you something to drink?" And he said, "Sure," so that she could open the refrigerator door, knowing that there's a light that comes on when you open the refrigerator door. And she hoped she would get enough light to be able to see who her assailant was. Similarly, at one point while he's in her apartment, she says, "Oh, I have to go to the bathroom. Can I please go to the bathroom?" And he says, "Okay." And she goes to the bathroom and turns the light on so that she can just get a glimpse of his face, her assailant's face, before he yells at her, "Turn the light off." So she does these things where she takes these opportunities to be able to see who her assailant is. He rapes her. She thinks he's going to kill her, and she is able to flee her apartment and go to a neighbor's house and knocks on the door, and they let her in. She's, screaming that she's just been assaulted and just been raped, and they let her in, and she calls the police. She sits down with a sketch artist, and they come up with a sketch of her assailant, and she's able to identify, come up with a sketch. Long story short, they pick up a guy who looks just like the sketch. She identifies him. She's convinced that that's the man who raped her. He's convicted of rape. He swears he didn't do it. 8 years later, they're able to do DNA testing. And his lawyers say to him, "Look, we've got some good issues, legal issues, to challenge your conviction, but those good issues will go away if we do this DNA testing and it proves that it's you," right? Because you can't just show that there was a legal error. You've got to show that the legal error was prejudicial in order to win on an appeal. And so the lawyer says to Ronald Cotton, "Ron, do you really want us to run this DNA evidence? Because if it shows that it's you, it's going to really ruin your appeal." Mr. Cotton says, yes, do the DNA testing. It wasn't me. They do the DNA testing, and sure enough, he's excluded as the rapist. And so the district attorney has to call this woman and tell her, "The guy that you identified based on the sketch that you provided, that we did based on your description, that man who we've convicted did not rape you. It's impossible. And she says she understands, but in her every night when she goes to sleep, she still sees him in her dreams, in her nightmares. And so she calls the district attorney and says, I'm having these terrible nightmares. I understand logically what you've told me, that he's not the guy, but I still see him raping me. I think I need to meet him in order to get his picture out of my brain. And the DA says, well, let me call his lawyer and see if he's willing to do that, if Mr. Cotton is willing to meet you. And again, long story short, they meet each other. She goes to apologize to him and he stops her and he says, you don't owe me an apology. You were raped. You did the best you could to identify who your assailant was. I hold no hard feelings toward you at all. And they developed this close relationship. And now they travel all over the country together, talking about the flaws with eyewitness identification, which are even worse when they're cross-racial. We just don't see each other very well when we're trying to identify someone of a different race. So I encourage you to if you're interested in this issue, pick up this book, Picking Cotton. It's a magnificent read. It's a really good story. I haven't done it justice, but eyewitness identification is very bad. I mentioned a little while ago, that there have been some wrongful executions. There's a new movie out on Netflix called The Phantom, about a man named Carlos de Luna in Texas. And the movie is based on an article that was written after a study by a Columbia University law professor and his students called The Wrong Carlos. Indeed, the homicide that Mr. de Luna was convicted of was in fact committed by a guy named Carlos, but they ended up picking up the wrong Carlos, and Carlos de Luna was executed in Texas for a crime he didn't commit. So thank you for that question. I'm grateful. Yes.
Can I ask, going back to what you said earlier before this question, you were talking about how our state is the only state that does not provide funding for indigent defendants. Who among our legislators is working to change that? And, how could we encourage that process?
I don't know who is. I think we need to be heard, so let me it's nearly 8 o'clock, and I want to open this up to more questions, but let me finish with a final story, if I might, that might shed some light on this and help open up some questions. Bear with me. It's about a 10-minute story, but I promise I can't promise you'll like it, but I think you'll find it a good story. So I was representing a guy in North Carolina named David Lawson, who was convicted of breaking into a house to steal property. It was a burglary, and he had been very careful in breaking into the house, but he didn't find. He had heard that this house had a lot of valuables, and he got in there and found that it didn't have a lot of valuables, and sort of was frustrated and was less careful exiting the house than he was entering the house. And so when he left the house, he set off the alarm. So the homeowner was just down the street at his father's house, and father and son heard the alarm, and so they jumped in the truck and drove up to the son's house. And the son said to Dad, you stay in the truck, and I'm going to go down to the house to see what's going on. And the homeowner went down to the house and sort of surprised David, and David shot him and killed him. And as David was walking up the hill, he sees the dad sitting in the truck. And so he shoots the dad. But the dad survived, thank God, and was ultimately able to identify David. And so David was arrested and charged with murder and was prosecuted capitally. And he told his lawyers, I don't want you to try and get me a life sentence. If I'm convicted of first-degree murder, I'd rather be executed than spend the rest of my life in prison. And so his lawyers abided by his request and did no investigation for purposes of the penalty phase of the capital trial. Now, just so you know, capital cases are really different than almost any other kind of criminal case. They're really done in two parts. They're bifurcated. There's a regular trial, just like there is in any other offense, where the jury has to decide guilt or innocence. And if the jury decides that the person is in fact guilty of first-degree murder, then there's a second little mini trial in front of the same jury, just on the issue of whether the sentence should be life or death. And that's held in short order after the guilt innocence part of the trial is over, but it focuses solely on life or death. So when David was convicted, his lawyers really did nothing to convince the jury to sentence him to life, not death. And in fact, David told his lawyers he wanted to get on the witness stand, which he has a right to. He had a right to, and we all, anyone who's charged with an offense has a right to testify in the Constitution. So he got on the witness stand and he told the jurors, give me the death penalty. I'd rather be sentenced to death than to life in prison. And the jurors obliged, and he was sentenced to death. And after his first appeal, then I got into the case later and started to investigate his background. He told me he didn't want me to do it. And I said, David, I hear what you're saying, but my job is to investigate your background, because until I do that, I don't know what's out there. And you have a right to say, don't put it on, but you need to know what you're saying no to putting on before you can make that decision, right? You can't make an intelligent decision about what to present or not present until you know what there is to present. So let me do the investigation and then we'll talk about it. And he said, okay. And as I was doing this, by the way, he was incarcerated in Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, the maximum security prison in North Carolina. And all death row inmates are required to get evaluated by the prison psychologist. And he was evaluated by the prison psychologist. And the psychologist went to him and said, David, I think you have really serious bipolar disorder. I'd like you to see the psychiatrist. And at first, David said, no, I'm not interested. But the psychologist had to keep seeing him. David had to keep seeing the psychologist. And finally, the psychologist prevailed on him. And David said, okay, I'm tired of hearing it from you. Sure, I'll go see the psychiatrist. And long story short, David was diagnosed with really serious bipolar disorder. The prison psychiatrist said it was as bad as any case he'd ever seen before. And that David also had very serious anxiety disorder. Now, the reason I share that with you is because I'm starting to do my investigation. David was raised in Central and North Michigan. And so I went up to Michigan and met with his family members and met with his teachers and met with coaches and met with all these people that knew him as a kid. And what I learned was that when he was 2 years old, his parents separated. And his mother, who was a nurse, didn't think she could both work full time and support him and take care of him, right? Because she couldn't both work full time and have him at her side. So she sent him to go live with her parents, his maternal grandparents, who told me that from the minute he got up in the morning every day to the minute that he went to bed at night, all he did was sit at the window waiting for his mother to come home. And of course, she never did. And 2 years later, his mom remarried. And so, having gotten comfortable finally living with his maternal grandparents, he was ripped away from them and taken back in with his mom, which he was happy about, of course. But the man who she married, his stepfather, really didn't like him at all and didn't want to have anything to do with him. And so his mom and his stepfather had a child of their own. And as he got older, the father refused to let David and his half brother play with each other, wouldn't let them interact because he just didn't like David. So his stepfather was abusive. He was an alcoholic and abusive, and did not beat David, thankfully, but did beat David's mom. So David was living in that environment. I talked to his aunts, who said that when David would come over to their house with his mom and stepdad, when he would leave, they would find hair all over the house because David, as a young boy, was twirling his hair and ripping it out in chunks and leaving it in their house. And I share that with you because the psychiatrist shared with me that that's a symptom of really serious anxiety disorder. To rip out your hair when you're a little kid. So at 10, David, who was sort of a stocky kid, strong and stocky, at 10, his stepdad came home one Friday afternoon and was drunk and started beating on his mom. And David just decided that was enough. And he charged his stepfather and knocked him down. And his stepfather got really angry and banned him from the house. And David's mother didn't stand up for David. She said, okay, if you insist that he not be here anymore, then he has to leave. And she put him out of the house. They locked him out of the house. And so he met some boys in Michigan, Mount Pleasant, Michigan, who were burglars. And he became a lookout, and they took care of him. They would feed him and give him a place to sleep. And he was their lookout when they would go commit burglaries. And that's how he was raised till he was 16 years old. When he was 16, he tried to enlist in the military, but he was not allowed to enlist because they said he had flat feet and couldn't pass the physical. So that was sort of a second rejection after sort of our third rejection, his mom having rejected, or fourth rejection, his mom having rejected him, and then him feeling rejected by his maternal grandparents who sent him back to live with his mom, and then being rejected by his mom a second time when his stepfather put him out, and then being rejected by the military. And so at about 17, he comes to North Carolina in search of his birth father. And I talked to a Salvation Army employee who remembered David coming to North Carolina from Michigan and trying to find his birth father, and related to me the day that she drove with him to his birth father's house when they finally found where his birth father lived. And his birth father's reaction was, if I'd wanted to have a relationship with you, don't you think I'd have reached out to you before now? I'm not interested. And he got rejected again. And so, having no family and no connections, he started committing these burglaries because what he discovered was that if he had a lot of money, he could buy stuff for people, and he could buy their friendship and buy their love. And he indeed made friends by buying people meals in restaurants, and then meeting their families and buying their kids stuff at Christmas time. And he did work a regular job. He worked as a pulpwood cutter, but ultimately supplemented his income by doing these burglaries, and that's when he got caught committing this homicide. And the jury, of course, knew none of this stuff that I've shared with you. They had no idea of his bipolar disorder. They had no idea of his anxiety disorder. They had no idea about the multiple rejections that he faced as a child, and how it came to be that he ended up taking the life of another human being. And that's really what we capital litigators do, is we try and share with the jurors who are going to decide whether someone should live or die, who this person is, not just what they've done on the worst day of their life, the worst day of someone else's life, but who they are as people and why they shouldn't be sentenced to death. And the jury heard none of this. And so I presented all of this to a court and tried to argue to a court that David's trial lawyer was ineffective and had failed to perform the basic functions that a trial lawyer ought to perform under the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution. But because David had told his lawyer, I don't want any work done to save my life, the courts rejected that claim. And so David's execution got closer and closer. And one day David says to me, Marshall, I didn't know that I had bipolar disorder till I got to prison. And maybe there are other people out there like me who are also undiagnosed. And if I share my story publicly, maybe they'll seek treatment. Because one of the things that happened when David got diagnosed is that he got put on medication, right? He got medicated for his bipolar disorder, and his demeanor was like completely different. And he understood once he was medicated the gravity of what he had done, and he felt terrible remorse, and he wanted to try and make things right, to try and sort of balance the scales, so to speak, the karmic scales. He asked me if he could write the family of the man whom he killed to apologize. I said, yeah, I think that's you can do that. I don't want you to do it over and over, but if you want to write them and apologize and explain to them how sorry you are and how remorseful you are, I don't think they're going to take it well, but yeah, do that if that's what you want to do. And he did. And he really did want to try and do everything that he could to balance these karmic scales. So he asked me, do you know any reporters that want to talk to death row inmates? And I said, David, all reporters want to talk to death row inmates. There's a famous saying in journalism: if it bleeds, it leads. Yeah, I think that there are reporters who would want to talk to you. He said, well, tell them to come see me. I'm glad to talk to them about whatever they want to talk about, but I'll have an opportunity to talk to them about, having been undiagnosed with bipolar disorder and how it affected my behavior and how different I am now. And maybe that will encourage somebody who, is also undiagnosed to go seek treatment. And so we started doing that. And as his execution got closer, he got more and more frenetic about that. And finally, he says to me, I want you to call Phil Donahue. Now, there are some of you who are in our audience who will know who Phil Donahue is. He was Oprah before Oprah. He did a nationally syndicated talk show that had a terrific audience. But anyway, he wanted me to call Phil Donahue, and we did. We contacted Phil Donahue, and the Donahue Show decided to do a story about David, and it did. And I went to New York, and David's psychologist went to New York, and his cousin went to New York, and the victims went to New York. And the Donahue Show didn't favor one side or the other. It just told this whole story that I've shared with you. Meanwhile, the state was moving forward toward David's execution. And when David was originally sentenced to death, he was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. Now, you know, this was 10 years later, or 15 years later, and North Carolina had abandoned gas chamber executions and replaced them with lethal injection. But because David had been sentenced to die by lethal gas, he had to sign a waiver saying he was okay with lethal injection rather than lethal gas. And so I took him the paperwork to sign, and he laughed at me. He says, "Marshall, you know, back when I was undiagnosed, I told the jury that I wanted the death sentence, not life. And now I want to live, and the state wants me to participate in the process by which my death is going to come about. Tell them I'm not signing the paper." And I said, "David, you know, everything I've read is that lethal gas is really horrible and awful and painful, and lethal injection is not. And I'm really encouraging you to sign this paper." And he said, "Marshall, I'm just not going to do it. I'm just not going to participate again in that process. So you tell them they're going to do whatever they're going to do, but they're not going to get my help." And I took him a bunch of affidavits and articles about people who had witnessed gassings, including articles about the concentration camps in Germany, and articles, you know, news articles and other articles from reporters and lawyers who had witnessed other executions in gas chambers, and said, please read over these before you make a final decision. And he did, but he stuck to his guns and said, "I'm not signing anything." So in early July of 1994, the state set this execution for David Lawson. And I told him that I wanted to be there because North Carolina hadn't carried out a lethal gas execution since the early 60s. And I wanted to make sure that if something went wrong, he had somebody there who could speak for him and stand up for him and say, "Hey, we ought to get the courts involved in this." And so I was there, and he asked if his psychologist could be there. We spent the day with him that morning. The Donahue show aired the morning of his execution. We were with him all day. He took last rites, and at 11 o'clock at night, we were taken away from his cell and told to go to the escorted to this visitor room. And he was taken into the little room where there was a big chair and a gas chamber. And they opened the curtains, and we could see him strapped into this chair. And when the execution began, we saw, a pellet drop into a bucket of ammonia, and cyanide gas, a cloud of cyanide gas start to rise. And he took a deep breath and gasped and shouted it out, "I am human." And he did that about every 30 seconds for several minutes until he couldn't say "I am human" anymore. He just could say "human." And he did that for a couple of more minutes until he could only say "hume." And he did that until he could only grunt to let us know that he was still alive. And that started at 1:02 in the morning and ended at 1:23 in the morning. And I had to watch him die in the gas chamber. They had to have a 5-minute flatline on an EKG, and the death certificate, which I had a chance to look at and get a copy of, said homicide. Because after all, it was human beings killing another human being. And I was pretty torn up about that. And I was prepared to sort of describe everything I'd seen, not as in greater detail than what I've shared with you all. And the Washington Post agreed to publish it. And then there was a slow white Bronco chase on the Los Angeles freeway the day before they were supposed to publish the piece. And it got knocked out of the pages of the Washington Post because there was other news that was way more important. And as I approached the high holidays that fall, I was pretty broken up because, you know, the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, are this annual time to reflect on how we've lived our lives and how we could do better and commit ourselves to doing better. The Hebrew word is Teshuva, to turn. And I'd never seen anyone make Teshuva quite like David Lawson had after he was diagnosed and treated for his bipolar disorder. And it was a pretty difficult time for me. So the next summer of '95, I decided to attend a religious retreat that the Reform movement sponsored in the Boston area. And I thought, you know, I could really use some renewal, some spiritual renewal. So I go to this retreat, and on the first morning of the retreat, I'm sitting down having breakfast with some people that I'd not met before, and they were asking what I did, and I told them, and they said, "Oh, have you met Andrew?" And I said, "No, who's Andrew?" They said, "Oh, Andrew's this guy from New Jersey that we just met, who was telling us that he just served on a capital jury." I said, "No, I hadn't met Andrew." And we went from breakfast to our morning religious services. And I usually take my religious services pretty seriously, and I get into it. But that morning, I really couldn't. I couldn't concentrate on my prayers because all I could think about was the fact that there was this guy in my community there at this retreat who had served on a capital jury. And, you know, I was coming there to try and get away from this and get some spiritual renewal. And this is what I hear. So after services, you know, I went up to a rabbi, and luckily there was no shortage of rabbis at this religious retreat. And I said to one of the rabbis, you know, I'm here, and I told him why. And then I hear that learned that there's this guy here who served on a capital jury, and I feel like my community is contaminated. And the rabbi says to me, "Marshall, do you know the Yiddish word beshert?" And I know we're running out of time, Vicki. I'm going to try and wrap this up. I said, "No, I don't know the Yiddish word beshert." He says it's a Yiddish word that means kismet, serendipity. Usually it's applied in a romantic context, you know, when two people meet. It's beshert that you and he are both here at the same time. You got to go meet this guy. You got to find him and hunt him out and talk to him. And I thought to myself, yeah, right. That's just what I wanted to do. But I said, okay. And I went to my first class. And guess who was in my first class at this retreat? Yep, Andrew. And so Andrew and I introduced myself and said I thought we had something in common. And so after the class was over, we went for a walk, and I told him about the work that I do. And he told me what it was like to be on this jury, you know, where you're asked to decide whether somebody should live or die. And the judge rattles off this hour-long instruction to you about how you're supposed to, what the law is and how you're supposed to make this decision, but you sort of don't get to hear it very well, and they don't provide anything in writing. And, you know, he's found himself in the jury room trying to figure out what the heck he was supposed to do. And, you know, he wanted to do the very best that he could and follow the law. And, you know, I heard what he was saying. You know, what a horrible thing to be asked to, you know, to be 12 citizens and decide whether this other human being should live or die. A terrible, terrible thing. And so we engaged with one another over the course of several days. And on the last day of the retreat, he comes up to me while I'm having breakfast and he says, hey, Marsh, can we talk? And I said, sure. And we go for a walk and he tells me, he says, you know, when we were trying to decide whether this defendant was guilty or innocent, you know, the judge gave us all these instructions and we didn't kind of know what he was saying. But we did hear the part about going to the jury room and elect a foreperson. And so we went in and elected a foreperson, and the foreperson said, well, I guess we should take a straw poll and see where everybody stands. And so they went around the room and people said either they thought he was guilty or not guilty. And so one by one, jurors said guilty, 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 guilty. And when they got to the 12th juror said, nah, I'm not really convinced. I would have to vote not guilty right now. And so they started talking about, what did the state prove? Did the state prove all of the elements? What are the elements of homicide? Did the state prove them all? Did they prove them all beyond a reasonable doubt? Did the defense put on, anything that might poke some holes in the state's case? And several hours later, they had talked the case through, and sure enough, they concluded that yes, the defendant was guilty. And so they were going to go out into the courtroom and announce their verdict. And just as they got to the door of the jury room, before they went out into the courtroom, they stopped and they turned to that one guy who had voted not guilty several hours earlier. And they said, back at the beginning, when we did the straw poll, it was 11-1, and you had voted not guilty. Did you really think he was not guilty back then? And the guy said, no, I kind of agreed with all of you, but we were tasked with sort of wrestling with this and making a decision based on what the evidence showed and what the evidence didn't show. And if all of us had just said he was guilty right at the beginning, we would never have wrestled with what the state proved and what it didn't prove and whether the defense put anything on. And I felt like that wouldn't be right. And so I said not guilty. Andrew looked at me and he said, Marshall, at that moment, I've never been more embarrassed and ashamed in my entire life, because that should have been me, and that wasn't me. He said, what you do, the work you do, it's hard, and it must be really tolling emotionally, but I hope you keep doing it because, as you talk to people about the death penalty, which we never think about, in American society, it just kind of happens. If you make us think about it and wrestle with it, that's what we're supposed to do, because in a democratic society, we are the government. I hope you keep doing it. And he gave me a huge hug. And at that moment, I felt more embarrassed and ashamed than I'd ever felt in my life, because I thought back to the first day of that retreat when I had sort of othered him. I had said, oh, my community is contaminated by someone who voted for the death penalty. How can I be in community with this guy? And I realized I'd done to him what people do to my clients every day, right? We other these people who commit homicides. We say, oh, they're not like us. They're different from us. I could never do that. And we have to kill them because they're so different from us. But in fact, we're all human beings created b'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. And we have to remember that no matter what someone has done, it's not, we don't judge people solely on the worst thing that they've ever done in their lives. We have to look at the whole picture. And we have to wrestle with what we do as a country and as a state, including whether or not we think we should be intentionally taking the lives of other human beings, no matter what they've done. And so that's what I'm asking you guys to do tonight, is to think about that and make a decision for yourselves, whether that's who we are, whether that's who we want to be. And if it's not, we got a lot of work to do. So I'm willing to take whatever questions that you want. There is an abolition bill in the Pennsylvania legislature right now. I encourage you that if you think that we ought to do away with the death penalty, repeal it, and make life in prison the worst punishment in our law, that you contact your legislators and let them know that's how you feel. It's a House Bill 999, and I'm glad to take any other questions that folks have. And thank you for indulging me and giving me an opportunity to share all of this with you.
Let me just say, why don't we give, because we are at 8:30 now, why don't we give Father Matthew a chance to just chime in with the Catholic teaching and a bit of the history. And if people can stick around for questions after that, that would be great.
Thank you, Vicki, and I'm sorry for going long.
Well, thank you. No, that was very interesting. Those were interesting stories about your experiences, and I think they help to inform all of us in terms of the gravity of this matter and the complicity of all of society in this ongoing injustice. For 17 years, we had a de facto federal moratorium on executions that occurred under most of the Bush administration, all of the Obama administration. And it wasn't until about 2020, under the Trump administration, at the end of the Trump administration, that he and the Attorney General Barr, who happens to be Catholic, implemented an execution, what has to be described as an execution spree at the end of that administration. The papal encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Social Friendship by Pope Francis, really set the ground for Catholic opposition to this execution spree by, among other things, calling for an end of capital punishment. But even before that, there was the change in the Universal Catechism in 2016, and Pope Francis in 2017, during the 25th anniversary of the initial version of the Catechism, explained that the Catechism is a living document that always seeks to secure its fundamental principles, and so that the truths in terms of the social teachings of the Church had not changed. But the question is how we better understand the fundamental truths, especially the dignity of the human person, preserving the dignity of the human person, as well as the possibility of the redemption of people after they have committed crimes, even horrendous crimes. And so the question is, how do you best defend those principles? And with the understanding that the Church's embrace of capital punishment in the past had to do with an emphasis of legalism over mercy. This is how Pope Francis described the understanding leading up to the first catechism in 2020. In the first catechism in 1992. And the idea that that it was based on this understanding that you uphold the dignity of the human person by a very legalistic and vengeful approach. And even then, Pope John Paul II had argued that, especially after promptings from the bishops in 1987, that the means, capital punishment, if you were going to make the argument that that was necessary to protect the population, which would be the going argument at the time, that this had been rendered inoperative because most states now have the capacity to protect citizens from any criminal who is caught and convicted and who would be likely to do people harm. So that argument really couldn't be made on the basis of harm. The question is whether or not then capital punishment becomes a means of vengeance. And we know that there are even those today who would make the argument that given the gravity of the crime of murder, that it requires an equally grave penalty of execution to show, I think in an ironic way, how much we respect life, that you would take a life of the person who has taken a life. Pope Francis argues that the church has always understood and that what is primary in the principles of Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the human person and the potential of redemption for the human person. And this takes precedent over demonstrating one's respect for life through a gesture such as taking the life of the other person. Not to mention the fact that is counterintuitive, a counterintuitive way to show respect for human life. Right now, the concern is that although President Biden ran on opposition to capital punishment and is first candidate to actually do so, that thus far, although he has implemented a return to the moratorium on federal capital punishment, that's not enough, and as was demonstrated by the Trump administration, that the de facto moratorium needs to be a fulfillment of the campaign promise to dismantle the federal death penalty. And when he meets with Pope Benedict later this month on October 29th, there is every expectation that the Pope will be pushing him on that issue, on actually dismantling the federal death penalty. Throughout, there had been a de facto moratorium during most of the COVID crisis, simply because of the restrictions that the crisis imposed. But as soon as it was considered, and this is ironic, safe enough to continue the executions, many of the states that still have the death penalty on their books resumed their executions. They have found it more difficult to acquire the chemicals to implement lethal injection because many of the pharmaceutical companies, after pressure from the public on this issue, have decided to withhold the chemicals for lethal injection. And they don't, because they didn't want to be associated with this controversial issue. So these states, such as South Carolina and Arizona and other states, have threatened to resume firing squads, electrocution, and death through gas that Marshall described so graphically, to resume that as a way of carrying out the executions. And so that's where things stand right now. Significantly within the Catholic Church and really beyond the Catholic Church, Fratelli Tutti has been a document to rally people around the issue of an enforceable or the actual dismantling of capital punishment in the United States. And that's pretty much where things stand right now. And of course, there have been revisions in the Catechism in 2016 as an update to reflect the trend, even under previous popes, towards acknowledging that the death penalty is a cruel form of punishment that is not consistent with the values of the church. And of course, I think many of you have read it. The article is number 2267, that recourse to death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial has long been considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. Today, however, there is an increasing awareness of the dignity of the person is not lost even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sanctions imposed by the state. And lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens but at the same time did not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person, and she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. So that is the statement in the Catechism. That's where things stand. Pope Francis has defended his stance on abolishing capital punishment by, again, pointing out the need for the development of the understanding of the doctrine requires putting aside positions and defensive arguments that already appear decidedly against the new understanding of Christian truth. It is necessary, therefore, to restate that however grave the crime that may be committed, the death penalty is inadmissible because it attacks the inviolability of the dignity of the human person. And tradition is a living reality, and only a partial vision can think of the deposit of faith as something that is static. The word of God cannot be conserved in mothballs as if it were an old blanket to be preserved from parasites. No, the word of God is a dynamic reality, always alive, that progresses and grows because it tends toward a fulfillment that men cannot stop. The law progresses, wrote Pope Francis, and appertains to the particular condition of the truth revealed in its transmitted, and it's being transmitted by the church, and does not at all signify a change in doctrine. One cannot preserve the doctrine, and that is the dignity of the human person and the potential for human beings for redemption. One cannot conserve the doctrine without making it progress, nor can one bind it to a rigid and immutable reading without humiliating the Holy Spirit. And so that is the basis for the response to our deepening understanding of both what it means for the state to carry out executions and what it means to uphold the dignity of the human person. So for those who would argue that this is some kind of radical change coming out of nowhere, the response is that the principle remains the same. And the question is how we defend that principle.
Thank you, Father. That's great.
Yeah, I'm aware of the time. I wonder if how people would feel about maybe giving your email to Kathy Raphael, if you're interested in continuing this conversation, and maybe even having another follow-up at some point. Just noticing that we're already 15 minutes over time, which I hate to keep people any longer than that. So Kathy, if you would be willing to put in the chat, the recording should be then at St. Mary Magdalene Pittsburgh pgh.org, which I put in the chat, and Kathy will let us know where on the site she's going to put it, and then maybe also just put your email in there, Kath, and people can let you know or let us know through you if they're interested in continuing the conversation. I know and if you know people who were here before who had to leave, then let them know that as well. But I want to thank Marshall and Father Matthew for both being here tonight. This is obviously, a lot of people are interested in this. The fact that you all seem to know what the bills are means that you're probably very actively involved and engaged in this as activists. And I, for one, would love to learn more about what other people in this group are doing and what you know. So please do consider sending Kathy your email. And there it is. It came up in the chat. And and hopefully we'll be able to continue it. But thank you so much, Marshall and Father Matthew, and God bless you. Kayla has a newborn baby, so she had to leave to put him to bed, but she would want to add her thanks as well, and Ray O'Hare, who also has been working on this. So again, hope to keep this conversation going.
Thank you.
Thank
I'd
you guys
just
for
like to
having me.
thank the dozen or so friends of mine that signed on tonight to commemorate what would have been the 75th birthday of my late husband and love of my life, Jerry Yost. So it's good to see everybody, at least on Zoom, some people from out of town too.
Great. A great way to commemorate that. All right. Good night, everyone. And hopefully we'll chat again soon. God bless you.
Thanks, Vicki.